Hello and welcome to Tea and Tales. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. If you've had a long day, if your mind feels tired, if you simply need to unwind before sleep, you've come to the right place. Take a moment now to settle yourself. Adjust your pillows, loosen your shoulders, and sink deeper into the comfort of wherever you are. This is your time. This is your space. Tonight we have something special. It's a story about a quiet boy and an unexpected discovery. In a world that often moves too fast, this boy moves slowly. He notices things. He pays attention. And one day, in a place he thought he knew, he finds something that changes everything. But don't worry, there's nothing frightening here. Instead, there's wonder. There's gentleness. There's the kind of discovery that makes your heart feel warm and full. So let yourself relax. Feel your breathing slow down. In and out, steady and calm. Listen to the rhythm of the words. And if your eyes grow heavy, if sleep begins to find you, that's exactly what we want. Let it happen. Let this story carry you. Whether you stay awake or drift into dreams, it's all perfectly fine. All that matters is that you're here, you're safe, and you're cared for. Now let's begin. The boy lived in a cottage at the edge of a small village, where the buildings gave way to forests and meadows. His life was simple and predictable, which suited him well. He preferred quiet to noise, solitude to crowds, and familiar routines to unexpected changes. Every morning, his body woke him without needing an alarm. He would rise, dress in the same clothes he always wore, and move through his morning tasks with ease. He would start a fire in his kitchen stove, boil water for tea, and sit by his window with the cup held between his hands. From there, he could see the path that led away from his cottage, winding through the meadow into the trees. In spring, wildflowers studded the grasses. In summer, they grew tall. In autumn, they turned gold and brown. In winter, they lay flat under snow. The boy had watched this cycle so many times that he found peace in its predictability. After his tea, he would walk the same path he walked every day. There was a creek not far from his cottage that he liked to check on. In spring it would rush with snowmelt, but by autumn it was barely a trickle. The boy would kneel beside it, dip his hand into the cold water, and listen to the sounds around him. The rustle of leaves, the call of birds, the whisper of wind. These sounds had rhythm, and the boy had learned to move in time with them. On some days, he would venture a little further from his usual path, but he never went too far. He liked to know exactly where he was at any given moment. He liked to understand the layout of the land around his home. Every rock, every tree, every small clearing had become familiar to him. He knew which birds nested in which trees. He knew where the best berries grew. He knew which spots received the most sunlight and which were always shaded and cool. This knowledge was a kind of wealth to him. It made him feel connected to the place where he lived. The boy had few possessions. He owned clothes, several books, cooking equipment, blankets, and little else. He grew some vegetables in a small garden near his cottage. He foraged for mushrooms and berries. He caught fish from the creek. He chopped wood from fallen trees to keep his stove burning through the cold months. None of this felt like work to him. It felt like living. It felt like being exactly where he was supposed to be. Other people in the village sometimes found his way of life strange. They would ask him why he didn't want to move to the town, where there were more people and more opportunities. They would ask if he ever got lonely. They would offer invitations to gatherings and celebrations, which the boy would politely decline. He wasn't unkind about it. He simply wasn't interested. He was content with his own company. He was happy with his simple routines. He had found a kind of peace that most people spend their entire lives searching for, and he wasn't about to give it up. One afternoon, in the middle of autumn, the boy decided to explore a part of the forest he hadn't visited in quite some time. The season was shifting. The leaves were turning their most brilliant colours. The air had that particular sharpness to it that comes only in autumn, when you can feel the cold months approaching, but they haven't quite arrived yet. The boy wanted to see if any trees had fallen since his last visit. Sometimes fallen trees created new paths, new clearings, new spaces to discover. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sound of the village faded away completely. There was only the sound of his footsteps, the rustle of leaves beneath his feet, and the wind moving through the canopy above. He walked past trees he recognized, trees that had been growing in the same spot for decades, perhaps even for more than a century. He felt peaceful here. He felt at home. The forest was as familiar to him as the cottage, the meadow, and the creek. After walking for some time, he noticed something unusual. There was a small clearing he didn't remember ever seeing before. It was possible he had simply missed it on previous walks. The forest was large, and it wasn't as if he had memorized every inch of it. But this clearing seemed somehow special. The afternoon sun was streaming through the gap in the trees, creating a pool of golden light on the forest floor. The boy walked toward it, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. A sense of curiosity, perhaps. A feeling that something in this place was different from everything else. As he stepped into the clearing, his eyes adjusted to the brightness, and that's when he saw it. There, resting in the leaves at the center of the clearing, was an egg. The boy froze. His mind took a moment to process what he was seeing. An egg, but not a small egg, like those laid by the birds he sometimes saw. This was enormous. It was nearly as long as his arm and half as wide. The surface was smooth, and it glowed with a soft, warm light, almost as though it were illuminated from within. The colour was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was neither quite red nor quite orange, but something in between, with veins of deeper colour running across its surface like cracks in the earth after a long drought. The boy approached slowly. Every instinct told him to be cautious. This was not a normal thing. This was not something he could file away into his comfortable understanding of the world. But curiosity won out. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what he was looking at. When he reached the egg, he knelt beside it. The warmth radiating from it was extraordinary. He held his hand above its surface without touching it, and he could feel the heat coming off it, like warmth from a fire. The glow intensified as he drew near, as though the egg were aware of his presence and was responding to it. Carefully, the boy reached out and placed his palm against the side of the egg. It was smooth and warm, and beneath the surface he thought he could feel something moving. The gentlest of movements. A flutter, a shift, as though something inside was stirring. Perhaps waking up. Perhaps noticing that someone was there. The boy pulled his hand back, but not in fear. He wasn't afraid of this egg. He was in awe. His heart was beating faster, and his breath had become shallow with excitement and wonder. All the predictability of his life, all the carefully maintained routines, suddenly seemed less important than this moment, this discovery, this mystery. He looked around the clearing to see if there were any clues about where the egg had come from, but there was nothing. Just trees and leaves, and the golden light of the afternoon sun. There were no tracks in the clearing that he could see, no signs of another creature. The egg simply was, as though it had always been there, waiting for someone to find it. The boy sat beside the egg for a long time. He didn't know what else to do. His mind was racing with questions. What was this thing? Where did it come from? What was inside it? Should he tell someone? Should he leave it where it was? Should he try to move it? As the afternoon light began to shift, as the sun moved lower in the sky, the boy made a decision. He couldn't leave this egg here. It was too precious. It was too strange. It needed care, it needed warmth, it needed to be protected. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain to himself, he felt like he was the one meant to protect it. The question was how. The egg was heavy. When he tried to lift it, he realized he would struggle to carry it all the way back to his cottage. He needed something to transport it in. He looked around the clearing and spotted a piece of bark that had fallen from one of the nearby trees. It was large and relatively flat. He gathered some of the softer leaves and created a kind of nest on the bark, being very careful not to jostle the egg. Then slowly and deliberately, he rolled the egg onto the nest of leaves. It moved with surprising ease once it started, as though the egg itself wanted to be moved, wanted to be taken somewhere safe. The boy secured it as best he could, wrapping some larger leaves around it to keep it stable, and then he began the careful process of carrying it back through the forest. He moved slowly, keeping his steps deliberate and measured. He was acutely aware of every root that might trip him, every uneven patch of ground that might cause him to stumble. The egg was warm against his hands, and occasionally he felt that gentle flutter again, as though whatever was inside was responding to his movements. By the time he reached his cottage, the sun was setting. The sky had turned the colour of a bruise, purples and deep oranges blending together on the horizon. The boy was tired, but his exhaustion was overwhelmed by his sense of purpose. He had brought the egg home. He had kept it safe on the journey. Now he needed to create a proper place for it. He set the egg down carefully on his hearth, as close to the fire as he dared without risking damage. The warmth from the stove would help keep it warm. The glow of the flames reflected off the egg's surface, making it seem even more magical than it had in the forest. The boy stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then he set about the work of preparing his cottage to be a home for this mysterious discovery. He gathered blankets and soft items, creating a kind of cushioned space around the egg so it wouldn't get knocked around if he bumped into it. He filled a bucket with water and placed it within reach. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that whatever was inside the egg would need water once it hatched. He also gathered food for himself. If he was going to sit vigil over this egg, he would need to eat. He made a simple meal of bread and cheese and vegetables from his garden. He sat at his table, not far from the egg, and ate slowly while watching the way the firelight played across its surface. As night fell, the boy prepared for sleep, but he found he couldn't leave the egg unattended. So instead, he dragged his mattress from his bedroom and placed it on the floor near the hearth, as close to the egg as he could get without disturbing it. He lay there in the darkness with only the fire providing light, and he watched the egg. He listened for any sounds. He waited to feel that flutter again. But as the night deepened and exhaustion finally overtook his excitement, the boy drifted into sleep. And in his dreams, he saw colours he had never seen before. He heard sounds like music. He felt a kind of joy that was pure and uncomplicated. In his dreams, the egg was glowing brighter, and inside it, something was beginning to change. When the boy woke the next morning, his first instinct was to check on the egg. He sat up quickly, heart racing, worried that something might have happened to it in the night. But there it was, glowing softly in the early morning light, looking exactly as it had when he had fallen asleep beside it. Perhaps a little warmer, perhaps a little brighter, or perhaps that was just his imagination, his mind adding details that he hoped were true. The boy rose and immediately tended to the fire, making sure it was burning well. He brewed his tea and sat in his usual spot by the window, but today his eyes kept drifting to the egg. He couldn't focus on anything else. His mind kept returning to the same questions that had occupied his thoughts the previous evening. What was it? Where had it come from? What should he do? He decided that, at least for now, he wouldn't tell anyone about the egg. It felt like a secret that needed to be kept, something private and precious. He would care for it. He would watch over it. And he would wait to see what happened next. The days began to take on a new rhythm. The boy's simple routines were altered by the presence of the egg. He still took his morning walk, still checked on the creek, still foraged for food. But now he hurried through these tasks, eager to return to his cottage. He still maintained his garden, still chopped wood, still did all the things necessary to live. But everything was done with a kind of distracted quality. His mind always partly focused on the egg, waiting for him at home. Each night, he slept on his mattress by the hearth, close enough to notice any changes. Each morning, he woke with anticipation, wondering if today might be the day something happened. But the egg remained unchanged. It continued to glow. It continued to be warm. And occasionally, the boy felt that gentle movement inside it, a flutter or a shift that made him certain that life was stirring within. He began talking to the egg. At first, it felt silly, but gradually, it felt natural. He would tell it about his day, what birds he had heard, what the weather had been like, about the village and the people he knew. He didn't know if the egg was listening, but he had a feeling that somehow it was. One night, as he lay beside the egg, the boy placed his hand on it and made a promise. He promised to protect it, to care for it with gentleness and patience, to give it whatever it needed, to help it into this world and stay beside it as it learned. The egg felt warm against his palm, and he could feel the flutter intensify, as though in response. The weeks passed. Autumn deepened. The leaves continued to change, and then they began to fall. The weather grew colder. The boy worked harder to keep his stove burning, to maintain enough heat not just for himself, but for the egg. It was around this time that he began to notice more significant changes in the egg's appearance. The colour seemed slightly darker, the glow seemed slightly brighter, and the movements inside seemed to happen more frequently, stronger, as though whatever was inside was growing larger, stronger, more active. The boy knew that hatching was coming soon. He didn't know how he knew this. It wasn't something he had learned from a book. It was more of a feeling, an instinct, a kind of communication that happened without words. The egg was preparing itself, and he needed to be ready. He prepared his cottage for the hatching. He created more soft spaces, more room. He gathered water in several containers. He made sure he had enough food stockpiled that he wouldn't need to leave the cottage for several days, maybe longer. He gathered candles and oil lamps so the cottage would be bright if the hatching happened at night. He gathered clean cloths. He did everything he could think of to prepare. And then one night, as the boy lay beside the egg listening to the wind rattling against the windows, he felt it, a vibration. Not the gentle flutter he had felt so many times before, but something different, something stronger. The egg was beginning to crack. The boy sat up immediately, alert and ready, but he didn't intervene. This was something the creature inside had to do on its own. He could only watch and wait and be present. He gathered his blankets around himself and settled in to witness whatever was about to happen. The vibrations continued, becoming more insistent, and then in the quietness of the night, he heard a sound, a high-pitched, fragile sound, like something very small and very determined, pecking at the shell from the inside. The boy's heart began to race. It was happening. Whatever he had been waiting for, whatever had drawn him to that clearing in the forest, was finally beginning. Through the night, the sounds continued. Crack after crack, the shell breaking bit by bit. The boy watched as tiny fissures began to appear in the surface of the egg, lines of light showing through from within. He didn't sleep. He couldn't have slept if he tried. He was completely focused on this moment, this miracle, unfolding before his eyes. And as dawn broke, as the first light of morning began to illuminate his cottage, the shell finally gave way. A piece of shell fell away, and with it came a small wet creature. The boy watched in wonder as something emerged. It was covered in glossy fluid, and had tiny delicate wings, still crumpled against its sides. The creature gasped as it took its first breath. The boy didn't move. He was witnessing something miraculous, and now, in the soft light of early morning, he could see what had been growing inside the egg all those weeks. It was a dragon. It was small, no more than the length of his forearm, from nose to tail. Its scales glinted in the firelight, a warm red-orange with veins of deeper colour. The wings slowly began to unfold and dry, translucent like stained glass, with delicate bones and membranes visible. When the dragon opened its eyes for the first time and looked at the boy kneeling beside it, the boy saw intelligence there, awareness, connection. The dragon made another small sound. It was a chirping, almost musical note, soft and questioning. The boy found himself making a sound in return, a gentle whistle as if in answer. The dragon's head turned toward him, its eyes large and luminous, fixed on his face. And in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition, as though this egg had been meant to find this boy, or the boy meant to find this egg, or perhaps they had simply been meant to find each other. The dragon worked its way out of the broken shell, its movements unsteady and uncertain. It struggled against the remains of the egg, and the boy wanted to help, but knew he shouldn't. This was the creature's own work to do. Just as the boy had had to carry the egg through the forest, the dragon had to break free from the shell on its own. That was how the world worked. That was how creatures became strong enough to survive. Finally, the last of the shell fell away. The dragon lay on its nest of leaves, exhausted from the effort of hatching. Its sides heaved as it breathed. Its wings were still crumpled and awkward, but it was whole. It was here. It was real. The boy very slowly reached out his hand, holding it palm up, not touching, just offering his presence. The dragon's small head turned towards him. Its nostrils flared as though it were smelling him, learning him. The boy could feel the warmth coming off the small body, could feel the life radiating from this tiny creature that had been nothing but a flutter inside an egg just moments before. Slowly, so slowly that he hardly moved at all, the dragon crawled toward him. Its legs were weak from being curled up inside the egg, and it stumbled, fell, struggled back up again. But it kept moving toward the boy, kept moving toward warmth and safety, and whatever instinct told it to trust this strange large creature that was gazing down at it. Finally, the dragon reached the boy's outstretched hand. It nuzzled against his palm, and the boy felt tears forming in his eyes. This was tenderness. This was connection. This was the most precious thing he had ever experienced. The dragon, still wet from the fluids of the egg, made small chirping sounds, and the boy made answering sounds in return. A conversation without words, a dialogue of presence and care and mutual recognition. The boy decided the dragon needed to dry off and rest. Very carefully, he gathered some of the clean cloths he had prepared and gently began to blot the wetness from the dragon's scales. The creature didn't resist. It seemed to accept this care, leaning into the boy's touch as though it had always known him, always trusted him. As he worked, he marveled at every detail of the dragon. The small claws on each foot, perfect and complete. The scales smooth and forming perfect patterns. The tail that coiled and uncoiled. The wings slowly dried and expanded, perfectly formed with every membrane and vein visible. The dragon yawned, a surprisingly small yawn for a creature that had just come into the world. Its mouth opened wide, showing the pink inside, and then it closed again. The boy realized the creature was exhausted. Breaking free from the egg had taken everything it had. He gathered soft blankets and created a nest within the larger space he had prepared. He gently placed the dragon in the center, arranging blankets around it so it would be warm. The dragon curled up, its tail wrapping around itself, its wings folding down against its body. Within moments, its eyes closed, and it fell into a deep sleep. The boy sat beside the sleeping dragon, watching the small chest rise and fall with each breath. He watched the way scales shifted in the firelight. He listened to the small snoring sounds the creature made. His entire life had changed in a single night. Everything he had known, everything he had assumed about the world had been transformed. But he didn't feel afraid. He felt a deep sense of rightness. This was where he was meant to be. As morning progressed, the boy thought about practical matters. The dragon would need to eat. He didn't know what dragons ate, but he would figure it out by observation. He had fish, berries, and vegetables in his cottage. He would offer these things and see what the dragon preferred. The dragon would need to learn to move, to stretch its wings, to develop its muscles. The boy thought about creating more space in his cottage for the dragon to exercise. The dragon would need to learn about the world. He imagined showing this small creature the forest, the creek, the meadow, walking through the woods with a dragon at his side. The boy decided, at least for now, to keep this secret. The dragon was too small, too vulnerable. It needed him as its only companion, its only source of safety, until it was strong enough to understand the wider world. The morning turned into afternoon. The boy made sure the fire was burning well, maintaining the warmth. He ate some food. Though he found his appetite was diminished, his focus entirely on the sleeping dragon. He drank water. He did the things necessary to maintain his own body, but all of these tasks felt secondary to the main work of his life now, which was protecting and caring for this creature. As the afternoon light began to fade, the dragon stirred. Its eyes opened, and it looked around, as though confused about where it was or how it had gotten there. Then its gaze fell on the boy, and something seemed to settle in the dragon's expression. Recognition, relief, security. The dragon stretched, its wings unfurling fully for the first time. They were slightly damp still, but they were drying, becoming more supple, more functional. The creature stretched its small limbs, flexed its claws, moved its tail back and forth. It seemed to be testing its body, understanding what it could do. Then the dragon opened its mouth, and a sound came out. Not the small chirp from before, but something larger. A hum, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to come from deep in its belly. The boy felt it as much as heard it, felt it vibrate through the air of the cottage, felt it resonate in his own chest. It was a sound of contentment, he thought, a sound of the dragon adjusting to the world, to being alive and free from the shell. The boy hummed in return, matching the pitch as best he could. The dragon's eyes brightened. It moved closer to the boy, crawling out of its nest with more confidence than it had shown before. Its legs were still unsteady, but they were growing stronger with every moment. It made its way across the space between them and climbed directly into the boy's lap. The boy remained very still, hardly daring to move. The dragon settled itself on his legs, its small weight pressing into him, its tail wrapping around his arm. The creature seemed to be seeking comfort, seeking security, seeking to be close to the one being it knew in this strange new world, and the boy provided that. He gently stroked the dragon's back, marvelling at the texture of the scales beneath his fingers, at the warmth of the creature's body. They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening. The boy and the dragon were united in a bond that felt like it had always existed. The boy spoke softly to the dragon about the cottage, about the world beyond, about all he would teach it. The dragon listened, its eyes closing, its breathing deepening. When darkness fell, the boy arranged himself and the dragon so they could both sleep. The dragon settled into the curve of the boy's side, using his arm as a pillow. The weight of the dragon against him was real. The warmth was real. As the boy drifted towards sleep, he marvelled at how completely his life had transformed. His world had been entirely predictable and solitary, and then he had found the egg and everything had changed. Now his life had purpose. It had this small, warm creature depending on him. The boy fell asleep with his hand on the dragon's back, feeling it rise and fall with each breath. In his dreams, he saw flights of dragons soaring through clear skies. He heard songs like bells. He felt a joy so pure that it seemed to fill the entire world. He was no longer just a quiet boy. He was a guardian, a caretaker, someone chosen to welcome a new creature into the world. The morning light filtering through the windows woke the boy before dawn. His arm had gone numb beneath the weight of the dragon, and when he carefully shifted position to ease the sensation back into his limb, the small creature stretched in response. The dragon's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment it looked confused, as though it had forgotten where it was. Then it seemed to remember, and its entire body relaxed. It made a soft chirping sound, a greeting of sorts, and the boy felt his heart swell with tenderness. He rose carefully, cradling the dragon against his chest so it wouldn't tumble to the floor. The creature was so small, so fragile in his hands, its wings still slightly damp in places. The downy softness near the dragon's head, still retaining some of the fluid from the egg, felt like velvet beneath his fingers. He moved slowly to the window and held the dragon up so it could see outside. Beyond the glass lay the world the dragon had been born into. The meadow was grey in the pre-dawn light, the frost making each blade of grass shimmer like tiny glass strands. The forest beyond it was a mass of shadows and darker shapes, mysterious and deep. The dragon made a different sound this time, a kind of questioning note, as though asking what all of this was, what it meant, where the light was coming from. The boy found himself speaking softly in response. his voice low and gentle, explaining that this was the world, that it was vast and beautiful and full of wonders to discover. He told the dragon about the sun that was about to rise, about how the darkness would give way to light, about how everything changed and shifted and revealed itself throughout the day. He told the dragon about the trees and the meadow, about the creatures that lived in the forest, about the stream that ran cold and clear near the cottage. He didn't know if the dragon understood his words, but understanding seemed less important than the tone, the presence, the communication that happened beyond language. As he spoke, he felt the dragon's body relax against his chest, felt the small heartbeat settling into a calm rhythm. The dragon's eyes tracked the movement of a bird passing by the window, and the boy realized that Ember's awareness was expanding, the world becoming more real and distinct with each moment that passed. The dragon needed to eat, and soon. The boy knew from the way Ember's movements had slowed, the way the dragon seemed to be settling into a kind of drowsy fatigue, that the effort of hatching had drained all of its energy. But feeding a dragon felt like the most important decision he would make, and he wanted to get it right. He wasn't certain what to offer, so he started with the simplest thing he could think of. He brought a small piece of fresh fish from his stores, fish he had caught and preserved the day before, and held it near the dragon's mouth. The creature's nostrils flared, and it made an interested noise, a kind of aspirated chirp that conveyed curiosity. The boy placed the fish on a small plate that had once held his breakfast and set it in front of the dragon. For a moment, nothing happened. The dragon sniffed at the fish with intense focus, tilted its head to one side, then the other, and looked up at the boy with an expression that seemed almost questioning. The boy could imagine what might be going through Ember's mind. What was this? Where did it come from? Was it safe? Could it be eaten? Then, with surprising delicacy for such a small creature, the dragon bent down and nibbled at the fish. Its tiny teeth, sharp and pointed, caught the flesh. It chewed slowly, thoughtfully, methodically, working through the piece with an earnestness that made the boy smile. The boy watched, barely breathing, afraid that the dragon might reject the food or become ill, afraid that he had made some terrible mistake. But when Ember swallowed, there was no distress, no signs of discomfort. Instead, the dragon made a satisfied humming sound, a low vibration that resonated through the cottage. The dragon continued eating until the piece was finished, and then it looked up at the boy. Its eyes were bright again, no longer drowsy. It chirped, a clear and articulate sound that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and a request for more. The boy laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and he went immediately to gather another piece of fish. If Ember wanted to eat, then the dragon would eat well. Over the next days, the boy established new routines that revolved entirely around caring for the dragon. He rose early, earlier than he had ever risen before, driven by an urgency that came from knowing a life depended on him. He tended the fire first thing, making sure it was burning well, because warmth was essential. Then he would make tea for himself, going through the familiar motions, almost unconsciously, while his attention remained mostly on the dragon. He would watch Ember stretch and yawn, would listen to the small sounds the dragon made as it woke, and would feel grateful for each new day that unfolded. He learned through trial and observation that the dragon would eat fish, would nibble at berries he gathered from the shrubs near the cottage, seemed to enjoy small pieces of meat that he carefully prepared by hand, and would even eat some vegetables. The creature wasn't picky about variety, but it had clear and pronounced preferences. It loved fish above all else. When the boy brought fresh fish from the creek, still glistening with water, the dragon's entire demeanour changed dramatically. Ember would become animated and eager, would chirp with excitement, would actually dance in place with anticipation. The boy found that preparing food became one of his favourite times with the dragon. Each meal was an opportunity to observe Ember's preferences developing, to notice which types of fish were preferred over others, to see how the dragon's tastes were becoming more refined as it grew. He began to recognise subtle differences in Ember's appetite. On some days, the dragon wanted fish primarily. On other days, it seemed to enjoy vegetables and berries more. The boy started to wonder if Ember was somehow directing his own nutrition, instinctively seeking what its body needed for growth and development. Eating became a bridge of communication between them, perhaps the most important one. The dragon would come running when it smelled food being prepared, would come skidding across the cottage floor with a sound of claws on wood. It would perch on the boy's shoulder or lap, would press its head against the boy's hand, and would make contented sounds while eating. The pleasure the dragon took in eating was pure and uncomplicated, and watching it made the boy happy in ways he couldn't quite explain to himself. The boy found himself talking to the dragon constantly during these moments, narrating everything they were doing in a low, soothing voice. He would describe what he was preparing, talking about the fish and how cold and fresh it was, how it had come from the stream that ran near the cottage, how the water there was clear and cold even in autumn. He would describe flavours and textures, using words that he'd never thought to use before. He would explain where each type of food came from, stories about gathering berries from the meadow or catching fish at dawn. Sometimes he would tell Ember stories about seasons past, about spring mornings and summer heat and winter snows yet to come. It was the kind of one-sided conversation that might have seemed foolish if anyone were watching, but the dragon seemed to listen intently. The boy could feel Ember's attention, focused on his face and his voice. The dragon would tilt its head to one side, would angle its ears toward him, and would watch his face with eyes that seemed to hold genuine interest and curiosity. Whether the dragon truly understood the words didn't matter. What mattered was that the boy was sharing his world with this creature, was inviting the dragon into his life through language and presence and constant, gentle care. The dragon grew at a remarkable pace that seemed almost impossible to the boy. Each day, it seemed slightly larger, slightly stronger, its movements becoming more coordinated and confident. The damp fluids from the egg dried completely within the first few days, and Ember's scales began to gleam with a lustrous shine. The wings became fully functional within a week, transitioning from crumpled and awkward appendages to elegant structures with visible musculature beneath the translucent membrane. One morning, as the boy was tidying the cottage, reorganizing things that Ember had scattered about in its explorations, the dragon suddenly flapped its wings with considerable force and lifted itself off the ground. The rush of air from the wings stirred the dust in the cottage, carrying with it the warm scent of Ember's scales. The dragon climbed 3 feet into the air, wobbled uncertainly as though confused by its own success, then dropped back down with a soft thud and a sound that might have been surprise or frustration, or both. The boy stopped what he was doing and turned to look at the dragon. He laughed then, a real laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, from the part of him that had been quiet and solemn for so long. It was a laugh of pure joy and wonder. The dragon looked up at him, shook itself, and the boy could swear he saw determination in its expression, a kind of resolve that said the dragon was going to master this thing called flying, was going to conquer the air. Every day after that, the dragon practiced with single-minded dedication. It would climb onto the boy's shoulder for stability and practice flapping its wings, gradually building strength and control over its own body. The wind from the wings would ruffle the boy's hair, would send papers flying, would create small currents of air that moved through the cottage. The boy created a space in his cottage where the dragon could practice safely, pushing furniture to the sides and clearing the middle of the room of anything fragile or breakable. He moved his table, his chairs, and stacked his books carefully in a corner. This space became a flight arena. He would watch from his chair, placed near the wall, as the dragon tried and tried and tried again, making short hops into the air that lasted only seconds. He would watch Ember become frustrated when altitude couldn't be maintained, would watch the dragon pause to rest, breathing heavily, and then try once more. The boy never offered guidance or criticism. He simply watched with patient attention, letting the dragon figure out what its body was capable of doing. Weeks passed in this rhythm of practice and rest. The dragon's hops became longer. The duration of each flight attempt extended. The boy could see Ember becoming stronger, could see the wing muscles developing, could see the dragon's understanding of how to manipulate the air itself grow more sophisticated. And then one afternoon, when the light was particularly golden, slanting through the windows at just the right angle, something changed. The dragon took several running steps, flapped its wings, and lifted into the air. But this time, instead of immediately tumbling back down, Ember stayed aloft. The dragon flew in a clumsy circle around the cottage interior, its wings beating frantically, its tail streaming behind like a banner for balance. The movement was awkward but powerful, and the boy found himself holding his breath, terrified that any sound or distraction might break whatever magic was happening. Ember climbed higher, approaching the ceiling, and the boy winced, thinking the dragon would collide. But instead Ember instinctively banked, turning away from the ceiling, and flew along the perimeter of the room in a kind of spiral pattern. The dragon made a sound while flying, a kind of triumphant cry, a pure expression of exultation. It scraped the ceiling with its back legs once before tumbling to the ground, landing hard and sliding across the wooden floor until it crashed into the wall with a soft thump. For a moment, there was silence. The boy was frozen, unsure if the dragon was hurt, afraid that the journey through the air had ended badly. Then Ember stood up, shook itself thoroughly, and made a loud chirp of triumph. The dragon had done it. The dragon had flown, truly flown, not just briefly lifted into the air, but actually achieved sustained flight. The boy scooped up the dragon and held it high, spinning slowly around the room in celebration, his entire body expressing the joy he felt. The dragon made excited chirping sounds, rapid and high-pitched, its entire body vibrating with joy and pride and satisfaction. The scales glowed warmly in the afternoon light. In that moment, the boy felt like a father watching his child take its first steps, felt like he was witnessing something fundamentally important and transformative. He felt protective and proud and overwhelmed with love for this small creature that had come into his life and changed everything. As the days turned into weeks, the dragon became increasingly bolder and more confident in its movements through the cottage. It would explore every corner, every surface, every space with meticulous attention. It would sniff at things for long moments, processing scents, learning to understand the world through smell. It would occasionally pick things up with its small claws, examining them, determining whether they were food or toys or simply interesting. The boy had to be very careful about what he left within reach. Socks disappeared, pencils got gnawed on, a tea towel was pulled off the counter and shredded. The dragon seemed particularly drawn to shiny objects, a preference that revealed itself early and persistently. The boy found it had collected several buttons from old clothes, a copper spoon that he'd been missing, a piece of polished stone that had been sitting on a shelf, and eventually a bit of coloured glass he'd found near the creek. Ember had arranged all of these items carefully in a corner of the cottage, a corner the dragon seemed to have claimed as its own special place, a hoard of treasures that the dragon would visit and admire and rearrange periodically. The dragon also developed distinct and charming personality traits that emerged gradually over the weeks. It was curious to the point of obsession and fearless in a way that occasionally got it into minor trouble. It would climb things it shouldn't climb, would attempt to scale furniture that was too tall, would launch itself from heights that seemed dangerous. It would chase dust motes through the air as though they were prey, would pounce on shadows, would make elaborate and imaginative nests out of blankets and pillows, creating spaces that it seemed to consider more comfortable or more private than others. It was also deeply and obviously affectionate. It would seek out the boy constantly, would pad across the cottage floor to find him if he moved to another room, would climb into his lap while he read, would settle on his chest while he lay in bed trying to fall asleep. Following him from room to room when he moved about the cottage became the dragon's favourite activity, as though being near the boy was the most important thing in Ember's world. The boy found this constant companionship moving and exhausting in equal measure. He would never have believed that such a small creature could require so much attention and yet give so much joy in return. The boy began to think of names. He sat by the window one morning, watching the dragon play with a piece of string he'd found and carefully presented as a toy. Ember was pouncing on it, attacking it with determined ferocity as though the string were a small animal. The boy tried out different words, different sounds, observing the dragon's reaction to each one. Some seemed to register, others clearly meant nothing, but one seemed to resonate differently, seemed to fit in a way that the others didn't. Ember. He said it aloud, and the dragon's head immediately turned toward him, attention focused and present. The way the light played on the dragon's scales reminded him of embers from a fire, warm and glowing and alive with inner light. Ember. Perfect. He said it again, and the dragon's head turned toward him once more, and the boy could have sworn he saw recognition in the dragon's eyes. Whether it was coincidence or whether the dragon somehow understood that this sound was its name, whether it could sense the significance in the boy's voice, didn't really matter. The name was right, and it fit perfectly. Ember was what this dragon was, and from that moment on, the boy called it nothing else. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the hatching, the boy decided it was time to take Ember outside. The dragon was strong enough now, capable of defending itself somewhat, and it needed to experience the world beyond the cottage walls in ways that no amount of looking through windows could provide. The boy was nervous about this decision, uncertain if he was being responsible or reckless, but he could feel deep in his bones that Ember needed this experience. The dragon would press its nose against the windows regularly and make longing sounds, a kind of wistful chirping that conveyed desire and curiosity. It wanted to explore. It wanted to experience the world it had been born into. He chose a clear autumn day for this first venture outside, a day when the sky was bright blue and the wind was gentle. The boy opened the door slowly and watched as Ember stepped outside for the very first time. The dragon moved cautiously at first, lifting each foot carefully as though unsure if the ground beneath its feet would hold, as though this new terrain might suddenly give way. The grass was damp with morning dew, and it must have felt strange against Ember's feet, different from the wooden floor of the cottage. But then, with growing confidence, the dragon began to explore with increasing boldness. Ember sniffed at the plants in the boy's small garden with intense focus, examining each vegetable and herb with careful attention. The dragon investigated the woodpile, climbing over the stacked wood with surprising agility. Ember poked its head into the shed, looked around at the tools hanging on the walls, and retreated, seemingly deciding that the space held nothing of interest. Everything was new and fascinating, and Ember experienced it all with the complete wonder that only a creature meeting the world for the first time could feel. The boy followed at a discreet distance, watching carefully for any sign of danger, though he couldn't truly imagine what threat there might be in this quiet place, far from any settlement or civilization. Predators were unlikely. The animals that lived in these woods would likely be more afraid of the dragon than the other way around. Still, the boy maintained his vigil, ready to step in if anything went wrong. Ember climbed onto a large rock that jutted up from the ground near the cottage, a rock the boy had always found useful as a vantage point for observing the weather or watching the sky. The dragon stood on top of it and looked around slowly, taking in the vast landscape that surrounded them. The meadow stretched out on all sides, the forest rising beyond it, and the mountains visible in the far distance. The dragon seemed smaller suddenly, set against the enormous backdrop of forest and sky and earth. The boy wondered what Ember was thinking, what impressions were forming in that small intelligent mind, what the world looked like through a dragon's eyes for the first time. They spent the afternoon exploring together, moving slowly through the familiar places the boy knew so well. He showed Ember places he had walked thousands of times, and they became new and strange and wonderful when seen through the dragon's perspective. At the creek, Ember discovered water and seemed fascinated by the way it moved, the way it reflected the light, the sounds it made as it flowed over rocks. The dragon waded in cautiously, then with more confidence, splashing in the shallows and making pleased chirping sounds. Then with sudden determination, Ember dove into the shallow water and disappeared for a moment. The boy's heart jumped into his throat, afraid that the dragon had gotten into trouble. But then Ember emerged, triumphant, with a small silver fish caught between its jaws. The boy watched in amazement and admiration as Ember swallowed the fish, its throat working, and then looked up at the boy, as though asking if there would be more. This seemed to awaken something primal in the dragon. Ember spent the rest of the afternoon trying to catch more fish, splashing through the water with increasing competence and understanding. The dragon would stand very still, watching the water intently, then strike with surprising speed. Not every attempt was successful, but by the end of the afternoon, Ember had successfully caught 3 more fish on its own. The dragon seemed immensely proud of these accomplishments, seemed to understand that hunting was part of what a dragon was supposed to do. As they walked back toward the cottage as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ember stayed close to the boy. The dragon would occasionally press its head against his leg, as though reassuring itself that the boy was still there, still present, still their bond intact. The boy understood this gesture. The world outside was vast and potentially overwhelming, and the dragon needed the comfort of known companionship. That night, the boy realized something had shifted. Ember was developing into its own being, becoming independent even as it remained bonded to him. The dragon didn't need to sleep in his arms anymore. It created its own sleeping space, a nest of blankets and soft things in the corner of the cottage. When the boy went to bed, Ember would sometimes join him, but just as often it would stay in its own space, content in solitude. The boy found this change both beautiful and bittersweet. He was watching Ember grow, watching the dragon become stronger and more capable with each passing day. And he knew, with a deep certainty that lived in his bones, that this was the right path, that Ember was meant to grow to become fully itself, to eventually need him less as it grew in power and understanding. But that time was not yet. For now, they still had each other. They had the cottage and the meadow and the forest. They had the routines that had begun to form, the rituals of care and connection. The boy would wake and make tea, and Ember would be waiting, ready to see what the day would bring. They would explore, and Ember would show him things he'd never noticed before, places he'd walked past countless times without truly seeing them. The dragon's presence transformed the ordinary world into something new and magical. One evening, about 2 months after the hatching, the boy sat outside with Ember perched on his shoulder. The autumn light was turning golden, that particular quality it had as the season deepened. Leaves were falling more frequently now, creating a carpet of red and gold across the meadow. The air smelled of earth and decay and the turning of seasons. Ember was larger now, perhaps 3 times the size it had been at hatching, though still small in absolute terms. The dragon's scales had deepened in colour, the warm reds and oranges becoming richer, more complex. Wings that had been almost transparent were now stronger, more opaque, with a depth of colour that caught the light beautifully. The boy thought about the egg he'd found in that forest clearing. He wondered if he would recognise the place now, or if it had already begun to fade from his memory, becoming dreamlike and uncertain. It felt so long ago, though it had been less than 3 months. His entire life had reorganised itself around this creature, and he couldn't imagine returning to the way things had been before. Ember made a soft sound, almost like purring, and the boy stroked the dragon's back. The scales were warm and smooth, and stroking them had become a kind of meditation, a physical expression of the bond between them. Ember closed its eyes and leaned into the touch, and in that moment the boy felt a completeness he'd never known before. This was his purpose. This was what he was meant to be doing. As darkness fell and the first stars began to appear, The boy realized he hadn't been to the village in weeks. He hadn't gone to trade for supplies or exchange news or interact with anyone else. He'd been living in a world that contained only himself and the dragon, and he had been entirely content. He wondered if anyone had noticed his absence, if anyone had been looking for him. But even wondering this, he knew he wouldn't change anything. He wouldn't go back to the way life had been before. Ember suddenly lifted its head and looked toward the forest, alert and focused. The boy felt the dragon tense beneath his hand, muscles becoming taut, attention sharpening. Then Ember relaxed, and the moment of intensity passed. The boy wondered what the dragon had sensed, what animal or sound had briefly captured its attention. Ember was becoming more attuned to the world around it, learning to read the subtle signals of the natural environment. They went inside as full darkness fell, and the boy prepared a meal for himself and Ember. This had become a comfortable routine. The boy and the dragon eating together, the boy sitting at his small table, while Ember ate from a low plate placed on the floor. After eating, they settled for the evening, the boy with a book, Ember curled in its nest nearby, both of them comfortable in the quiet of the cottage. The boy thought about the future with a kind of peaceful acceptance. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know how much longer Ember would remain this size, or when the dragon might become too large for the cottage. He didn't know what Ember would want or need as it continued to grow and develop its own understanding of the world. But he found he wasn't afraid of these unknowns. Whatever came, they would face it together. As he read, Ember would occasionally make small sounds, and the boy would look up to check on the dragon, finding it usually asleep or drowsy, safe and content in the warmth of the cottage. These moments of quiet companionship, these simple evenings together, felt like everything the boy had been searching for without knowing he was searching for it. The boy had found the egg by accident, or so he'd thought, but now he understood that there was no such thing as accident. The egg had been waiting in that forest clearing, and he had been ready to find it. Ember had been developing inside that shell, waiting for the day when it would be born into the care of someone who would love it completely and ask nothing in return but companionship and trust. He closed his book and sat for a long time just watching the dragon sleep, listening to the small sounds it made, feeling the steady presence of another living being in the cottage with him. The fire crackled softly in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scents of autumn. And inside, in this small space that had become a kind of sanctuary, the boy and the dragon existed in perfect peace, each caring for the other in ways that neither of them had ever experienced before. The morning light filtering through the windows woke the boy before dawn. His arm had gone numb beneath the weight of the dragon, and when he carefully shifted position to ease the sensation back into his limb, the small creature stretched in response. The dragon's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment it looked confused, as though it had forgotten where it was. Then it seemed to remember, and its entire body relaxed. It made a soft chirping sound, a greeting of sorts, and the boy felt his heart swell with tenderness. Winter came early that year, and with it came changes that the boy had not fully anticipated. The first snowfall arrived in late autumn, earlier than expected, blanketing the meadow and the forest beyond in a thick layer of white. The boy stood at the window, watching the snow fall, each flake drifting down from the grey sky and landing on the world below. Beside him, Ember watched too, the dragon's eyes tracking the movement of individual flakes, its head tilting in wonder at this new phenomenon. The boy had never truly considered what it meant for a dragon to experience winter for the first time. Ember had been born into autumn, had spent its entire brief existence in the mild warmth of the cottage and the cool but not frigid air of the meadow and forest. But now, with snow on the ground and the temperature dropping each night, things were changing rapidly. The boy could feel it in the shift of Ember's behaviour, in the way the dragon seemed more restless, more driven by instincts that the boy couldn't quite understand or name. There was something primal awakening in the dragon, something that the months of domestic comfort and human companionship could not entirely suppress or transform. The boy watched this awakening with a mixture of fascination and the beginning of understanding. When he looked at Ember now, he could see something else emerging beneath the affectionate creature that had slept in his arms and followed him from room to room. There was wildness returning, the ancient knowledge that lived in the dragon's blood reasserting itself as the seasons shifted. The cottage, which had felt like a sanctuary to both of them through the autumn months, was beginning to feel slightly too small. The boy would notice Ember pacing, moving from one room to another, unable to settle completely as the weather grew colder and the days grew shorter. The dragon would stand at the windows for longer periods, watching the snow accumulate, watching the way the landscape transformed under the white blanket. The boy understood without being told that Ember was remembering something about what it meant to be a dragon, something that lived deeper than the bonds of affection and care that had formed between them. Ember's appetite changed as the weather grew colder. The dragon began eating more, consuming significantly larger quantities of fish and meat than it had before. The boy would spend hours preparing food, filleting fish with careful precision, cutting meat into appropriate portions, always searching for ways to keep his companion satisfied and nourished. At first, he thought perhaps the cold was simply making Ember require more fuel to maintain body temperature. But as he watched the dragon eat with an intensity and focus that went beyond simple hunger, he began to wonder if this was something else entirely. The boy wondered if this was normal growth, or if the approaching winter was triggering something deeper, some ancient knowledge buried in the dragon's blood that he, a human boy who had spent his entire life in one cottage in one meadow, could never fully comprehend. Ember's scales, which had been a warm orange-red when the dragon first hatched, began to deepen in colour as autumn turned toward winter. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, the scales becoming more crimson and burgundy, the gold undertones becoming richer and more pronounced, until the dragon seemed to glow with an inner warmth that matched no fire the boy could kindle. The boy would sometimes stand very still and simply watch Ember move through the cottage, watching the way light played across those changing scales, the way the colour deepened and shifted, depending on how the dragon positioned itself in relation to the firelight. It was beautiful, this transformation, and it filled him with a complicated sense of awe and something he could only describe as bittersweet anticipation. The dragon seemed to be preparing for something, some transition or change that was approaching, though the boy couldn't have said exactly what. But he could feel it in the way Ember moved, in the way the dragon seemed to be gathering strength and focus, as though readying itself for something important. One afternoon, as the boy was preparing dinner, Ember suddenly became very alert. The dragon's head snapped up from where it had been drowsing by the fire, and it made a sound the boy had never heard before, a sound that was neither chirp nor purr but something in between, something that held an almost musical quality to it. The boy looked up from his work, following the direction of the dragon's gaze. Ember was looking out the window toward the forest, and the dragon's entire body was tense with attention. The boy walked to the window and looked out. The snow was falling more heavily now, and the forest beyond the meadow was obscured by white. But there, at the edge of the clearing, he saw movement. A deer had ventured out of the forest and was moving slowly through the snow, its brown coat making it visible against the white background. The boy watched as Ember made that strange musical sound again, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the dragon. This was instinct. This was the wild nature of what Ember truly was, beneath the affection and the companionship and the bonds they had formed in the cottage. This was a dragon recognizing prey, or perhaps simply recognizing something that represented the world beyond the walls of the cottage. The boy felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise up in him. Pride in what Ember was becoming, a kind of bittersweet recognition that this creature was not meant to remain dependent forever, and underneath it all a deep and abiding love that made him want to protect Ember, even from itself. The deer moved away, disappearing back into the forest, and Ember relaxed slightly. But the dragon remained at the window, watching the space where the deer had been, and the boy understood that something had awakened in his companion. The world outside was calling to Ember in ways that the boy and his cottage simply could not answer. As December deepened, the boy found himself making decisions that surprised him. He began to deliberately spend more time away from Ember, not in ways that seemed harsh or punitive, but in small, gentle ways. When he went to tend the woodpile, he would leave the door open and not invite Ember to follow. When he gathered water from the well, he would do so without the dragon's constant company. He realized, with a clarity that both broke his heart and felt absolutely necessary, beginning to prepare Ember for independence. The dragon seemed to understand this shift, though the boy couldn't have explained how. Ember would sometimes follow him outside, but increasingly often the dragon would remain in or near the cottage, content in its own space. The dragon had begun to spend more time on the roof, which the boy had thought impossible until one afternoon when Ember, practicing the coordinated flight that had improved so dramatically over the autumn months, simply flew up onto the cottage's sloped surface and remained there, watching the landscape spread out below. From the roof, Ember could see further than from the windows. From the roof, the dragon could watch the movements of birds and small animals, could track the passage of deer across the meadow, could observe the world in its full complexity. The boy would sometimes find Ember perched there in the early morning or late afternoon, the dragon's golden eyes scanning the landscape with an intensity that spoke of emerging knowledge and instinct. These moments of observation seemed to matter deeply to the dragon, and the boy learned not to interrupt them, understanding that something important was happening when Ember sat silently watching the wilderness. The boy found that his own emotions became more complex during these weeks of transition. He would watch Ember on the roof and feel a swelling of pride and love, but underneath that ran a current of something more difficult to name. It was loss, perhaps, or anticipation of loss. It was the awareness that what they had been sharing was fundamentally changing, that the tight bond of constant companionship was loosening. The boy would sometimes sit by the cottage window and watch the dragon watching the world, and he would feel tears prick his eyes without fully understanding why they came. But he did not try to stop them or push the feelings away. He simply acknowledged them as part of what it meant to love something that was meant to grow beyond you. The boy began, almost without fully acknowledging what he was doing, to take Ember on longer expeditions into the forest. These journeys became a kind of preparation, though whether he was preparing the dragon or himself, he wasn't sure. Not the short walk to the creek that they had done so many times, but longer journeys into the deeper woods, travelling further from the cottage and the meadow, pushing further into wild territory that the boy had rarely explored on his own. On these expeditions, Ember would hunt more seriously, would catch fish with increasing efficiency, would pounce on small creatures that crossed their path with a speed and agility that took the boy's breath away. The boy watched these hunting moments with a complicated mix of emotions. There was pride, certainly, in seeing the dragon develop its skills and capabilities, but there was also a kind of gentle sorrow, the recognition that with each successful hunt, Ember was moving further into the world of wild dragons and further away from the domestic creature that had slept in the boy's arms. The boy began to understand that this process of letting go was not something that would happen all at once, in a single moment of departure. Instead, it was happening gradually, in increments through small choices and larger transitions. Each time Ember spent more time in the forest and less in the cottage, the dragon was moving further along a path toward independence. Each time the boy chose not to call the dragon back, not to demand constant companionship, he was facilitating that movement. One afternoon, as they walked deep in the forest, Ember caught a rabbit. The boy watched as the dragon pounced with deadly accuracy, watched as the dragon's natural instincts took over completely. The boy felt no horror or revulsion at what he witnessed, only a kind of humble recognition that this was what dragons did, what Ember was meant to do. The boy sat on a fallen log while Ember ate, and he thought about the mercy of instinct, the way that knowledge carried in blood and bone could guide a creature toward its true nature, far better than any human could. Ember was becoming wild, not in a way that was frightening or unexpected, but in a way that was inevitable and necessary and right. The dragon was learning to be what it was meant to be, learning to move through the forest with confidence and competence, learning to find food and shelter without the boy's intervention. And the boy's role was gradually transforming in response. He was no longer the primary provider, the one who held and comforted and protected. He was becoming something more like a guide, a companion who walked alongside but did not direct or control. It was a different kind of love, one that the boy was learning as he went, one that required a kind of strength he didn't know he possessed. One evening, in early winter, the boy sat by the fire, with Ember nestled against him, the dragon's head resting on the boy's lap. They sat this way often, though less frequently than they had even a few weeks before. The fire crackled softly, sending orange light dancing across the walls of the cottage. Outside, snow was falling again, creating that particular silence that only fresh snow brings. The boy stroked the dragon's scales, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his fingers. He thought about the question that had begun to occupy more and more of his mind, the question he'd been avoiding but could no longer ignore. What would happen when Ember became too large for the cottage? What would happen when the dragon's needs expanded beyond what the boy could provide? What would happen when Ember's instincts called it to something larger than the bond they had created together? He didn't have answers to these questions, but he was beginning to understand that he didn't need to have them yet. For now, in this moment, they were together. The dragon was warm and safe, and the boy was exactly where he wanted to be. The future would come in its own time, and he would face it when it arrived. Ember made a small sound, a contented chirp, and the boy's fingers continued their gentle stroking. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the meadow in deeper white, covering the roof of the cottage, covering the world in a blanket of quiet and peace. And inside, the boy and the dragon existed in their own small circle of warmth and light, asking nothing of each other except presence and care. The winter deepened. By mid-January, the snow lay several feet deep on the ground, and the forest had become a silent, frozen world that seemed almost untouched by any living thing. The boy had stocked the cottage well before the worst weather arrived, had filled his stores with preserved fish and vegetables, had gathered enough firewood to last through the coldest months. He had prepared as best he could for both himself and Ember, but preparations, he found, could only account for so much. Ember grew at a rate that seemed to accelerate as the winter progressed. By the time January turned to February, the dragon had nearly doubled in size from the previous autumn. The dragon was no longer small enough to curl comfortably in the boy's lap. It was no longer possible for Ember to sleep in the boy's bed, though occasionally the dragon would attempt to anyway, leading to an awkward shuffle of limbs and wings and scales that would eventually resolve with Ember finding space on the floor nearby. The boy had begun to wonder, with increasing frequency, whether Ember could even fit through the cottage door soon. The dragon's wingspan had grown to impressive proportions, easily 4 or 5 feet across now, and Ember's body was developing a muscularity and density that suggested the dragon would continue to grow even larger. One morning, watching Ember try to navigate the space in the cottage, inadvertently knocking over a chair with a careless sweep of the tail, the boy made a decision. He would need to expand Ember's territory to provide the dragon with space that could accommodate its growing size. He would need to, in some way, begin the process of releasing Ember into something larger than the small world of the cottage and the boy's immediate care. The thought filled him with a melancholy that he hadn't experienced before, not even when he had first understood that Ember was beginning to become independent. This was different. This was not a gentle, natural progression. This was an active choice to let go, to step back, to acknowledge that what had sustained their relationship in the cottage could no longer sustain it. The boy spent several days preparing a shelter in the forest near the cottage, about 100 yards from the front door. He selected a location beneath several large evergreen trees, a place that would provide some shelter from the snow and wind. He brought materials from the cottage and the shed, constructing a framework that Ember could shelter in, lining it with blankets and hay, creating a space that was warm enough for the dragon to survive in, even in the cold months. When he showed Ember the new shelter, flying the short distance with the dragon and then walking alongside as Ember explored the space, he watched his companion investigate every corner of the structure. Ember seemed to understand, on some level, that this was important. The dragon made several circuits of the shelter, testing its stability, examining the way the branches provided cover, the way the openings allowed for easy entry and exit. The first night Ember spent there, the boy stayed awake in the cottage, listening for any sign of distress. But no distress came. Morning arrived, and when the boy went out to check on the dragon, he found Ember awake and alert, apparently having slept well. The dragon greeted him with a series of happy chirps and proceeded to eat the breakfast, a fish that the boy had brought. After that, Ember split time between the cottage and the shelter, sleeping sometimes in one place and sometimes in the other. The pattern seemed to suit the dragon, and the boy, while sad about what this represented, found that it felt right. He was not abandoning Ember. He was not betraying the bond they had formed. He was, he realized, loving Ember in the way that true love sometimes required, by allowing for growth and independence even when it meant stepping back. February was the darkest and coldest month, and the boy often found himself sitting in the cottage in the evenings, doing needlework or reading, waiting for Ember to return. The dragon would always return, would always come back to the cottage and to the boy, would always curl up for a while in companionship before eventually choosing to go back to the shelter or to spend the night hunting or flying through the forest. This dance of separation and reunion became the new rhythm of their relationship. And while it was not the constant companionship they had shared before, there was something beautiful about it. Each reunion felt precious. Each moment together felt earned somehow, chosen rather than simply a function of proximity and necessity. By the time spring approached, by the time the first signs of the snow beginning to melt appeared, Ember had become something altogether different from the small creature that had hatched from the egg. The dragon was nearly 5 feet long from nose to tail, with a wingspan of easily 7 feet or more. The scales had deepened to a rich burgundy colour, with hints of gold that caught the light. The eyes were bright and intelligent and fierce. The dragon's movements had become powerful and assured, moving through the world with a confidence that made it clear Ember understood what it was. One afternoon in late February, the boy was gathering water from the well when he heard Ember make a sound from the forest, a long wailing cry that was unlike any sound the dragon had made before. It was a call, the boy understood immediately, a sound that carried across the forest and echoed back from the distant hills. He stood frozen, the bucket half full in his hands, listening as the sound seemed to roll across the landscape like thunder. The cry held something primal and ancient in it, something that spoke to a part of the dragon that had nothing to do with the boy or the cottage or the bond they had formed. The boy set down the bucket slowly, standing motionless in the snow, listening for the sound to come again. When it did, it seemed even further away, as though Ember was moving deeper into the forest with each call. And in that moment, he understood something that made his heart catch in his throat, made his breathing become shallow and careful. Ember was calling out, not to him, to something else, to whatever dragons called to whatever world the dragon was reaching, toward as it grew and changed and became more fully itself. The boy realized with a clarity that was almost painful that this was the sound of a creature reaching toward its own kind, or toward its own destiny, towards something that lived completely beyond the boy's ability to comprehend or satisfy. The boy set down the bucket and walked back to the cottage. He moved slowly, each step feeling deliberate and heavy. He didn't call out to the dragon. He didn't try to interrupt or reclaim what was happening. He didn't attempt to run after Ember or demand that the dragon return to him. Instead, he simply acknowledged, in his own heart, that a shift was taking place, that another change was coming, that the chapter of his life with Ember was moving toward a conclusion that he had been preparing for but was not yet ready to face. The understanding filled him with a kind of dread mixed with acceptance, a knowledge that events were now unfolding that he could not control and could only witness. His role was changing from participant to observer, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that transition, even though he knew it was necessary and right. So he made dinner and left a portion outside the shelter, unsure if Ember would return that night. The dragon did not return, and the boy, for the first time since the egg had hatched, spent the night alone in the cottage, listening to the wind and the dripping of melting snow, understanding that even love that was fierce and true could not hold something that needed to fly beyond the boundaries of what had contained it before. The cottage felt very large and very empty that night, the silence broken only by the sounds of the storm and the boy's own breathing and the crackling of the fire. Morning came, pale and grey, and the boy went out to look for Ember. He followed the dragon's tracks in the snow, visible to his eyes as subtle depressions in the white surface. He tracked the pattern of Ember's movements, could almost see the moment when the dragon had taken flight, the snow scattered and disturbed by powerful downstrokes of wings. He found the dragon in the forest, several miles from the cottage, standing atop a high hill that overlooked the landscape in all directions. The dragon seemed larger in the open air, more substantial and powerful. Ember turned when the boy approached, recognizing him, and came down from the hill to greet him with a series of welcoming chirps. They walked together for a time, not speaking, not needing to speak, simply existing in proximity and acknowledging the bond that remained even as things changed. The boy understood, in these shared moments of silent companionship, that they would continue to meet like this, would continue to acknowledge each other across the growing distance between them. On the walk back, the boy made a final decision. He would not ask Ember to stay. He would not try to keep the dragon confined to the shelter or the cottage or even the proximity of the forest near his home. If Ember wanted to leave, if the dragon wanted to fly into the larger world and discover what it meant to be fully and completely wild, he would let it go. The understanding brought with it both pain and peace. Pain because losing Ember would be like losing a part of himself that he had only recently discovered. Peace because he could feel, in the settling of that decision, that it was the right one. Ember deserved to be free. Ember deserved to become whatever it was meant to become. And the boy's love, his deepest and truest love, would be expressed not by holding on, but by letting go. They returned to the cottage as evening fell, and the boy prepared a final meal together, a feast of fresh fish and meat, preparing all the things that Ember loved most. They ate together, the boy at his table, and Ember at its own place on the floor, and then they sat by the fire as the darkness deepened outside. The boy held Ember close, stroking the dragon's scales one final time, memorizing the feel of them, the warmth, the resilience of muscle beneath the beautiful armor. He memorized the sound of the dragon's breathing, the particular quality of Ember's presence beside him. He committed to memory the way the firelight played across the scaled skin, the way Ember's eyes reflected the flames in two small points of gold. He whispered to the dragon, not knowing if Ember could understand the words, but knowing that the tone, the presence, the love in his voice would carry meaning. He told the dragon that it was brave and strong and beautiful. He told it that the world was waiting for it, that there were forests and mountains and skies that had been created for dragons to explore. He told it that it would find others of its kind, that it would discover things the boy could never show it, that it would become something magnificent and wild and free. He told it that no matter where it went or what it became, the love between them would remain, unchanging and eternal. He promised the dragon that carrying this bond would not make it weaker or less wild, but would instead be something it could carry within itself, a kind of strength and certainty that would sustain it through whatever challenges the larger world presented. Ember rested against him, and the boy could feel the dragon's heartbeat, could feel the life that thrummed through this creature that had come to mean everything to him. The heartbeat was strong and steady, the pulse of a creature fully alive, fully present, and in that moment, with the fire crackling and the snow still falling softly outside the windows, the boy understood something profound about love. It was not about possession or control. It was not about keeping something small and safe and contained. It was about wanting the very best for another being, even if that meant releasing it, even if that meant accepting that some chapters must end so that others could begin. The boy understood that love, true love, meant being willing to become smaller in another's life so that they could become larger in their own. It meant finding joy in watching someone move toward their own destiny, even when it meant losing them. And as he sat there with Ember, feeling the warmth of the dragon against his chest, feeling the beating heart of his companion, he made peace with what was coming. He was ready to let go, even though letting go would break his heart in ways he was only beginning to understand. The morning after that night, Ember returned to the cottage. The dragon did not seem changed by the disappearance, did not seem to recognize that something fundamental had shifted in the world. The boy did not ask where the dragon had been, or what Ember had been doing in those hours alone. He simply accepted the return as a gift, a moment of grace that he hadn't expected. They ate breakfast together, and it tasted sweeter than it ever had before, because he understood now that there would not be endless mornings like this. That morning was a treasure, something to be held carefully and remembered. Spring came earlier that year, the snow beginning to melt in earnest by late February, the ice on the creek cracking and breaking apart to reveal rushing water beneath. The boy watched the world begin to wake again, watched as the first brave shoots of green began to emerge from the softening earth. Ember watched too, and the dragon's restlessness grew more pronounced with each passing day. The calls from the forest continued, occasional and haunting, carrying something in them that spoke to ancient instincts and distant memories. The boy made a decision that he knew would be difficult but necessary. He would spend these last weeks of winter and early spring giving Ember everything he possibly could. Not material things, not the comforts of the cottage or the safety of the meadow, but experiences. He would show the dragon the world, would teach Ember about the beauty and the vastness and the possibility that lay beyond the boundaries of what they had shared together. They began to take longer flights. The boy had learned to ride on Ember's back, holding carefully to the scales just behind the dragon's shoulders, feeling the powerful muscles contract and expand as the dragon's wings beat against the air. At first, these flights had been frightening, the ground falling away beneath them, the world spreading out below in a dizzying landscape. But the boy had grown accustomed to it, had learned to trust in Ember's strength and capability. Now he actually found peace in the flying, found something almost meditative about soaring through the open air. They would fly out across the meadow and over the forest, Ember moving with increasing confidence and strength. The boy would look down and see the landscape transformed from this new perspective, would see the rivers winding through the trees like silver threads, would see the roads that connected distant villages, would see the vast network of the world spreading out in all directions. And with each flight, he could feel Ember growing more comfortable, more at home in the sky, more fully becoming the creature that the dragon was meant to be. On one particular afternoon in early March, they flew further than they ever had before. Ember carried the boy higher and higher until the world below became abstract, a patchwork of colours and shapes that seemed to exist in a realm slightly separate from reality. The boy could see mountains in the distance, their peaks still white with snow, despite the warming temperatures below. He could see the curve of the horizon, could see clouds moving across the sky at eye level, could see the sun beginning its descent toward the western hills. And in that moment, suspended between earth and sky, the boy felt something shift inside himself. This was what Ember needed. This vastness, this freedom, this space to become fully and completely wild. No cottage could contain this. No amount of love could keep this creature bound to the ground and to the domestic world when it had been born to soar through skies that seemed endless. When they returned to the cottage that evening, the boy knew that the time was approaching. He could feel it in the way Ember moved, in the way the dragon's body seemed to vibrate with an energy that could not be contained within the walls of the cottage. The boy could feel it in the way the dragon's eyes fixed on the horizon more often than they fixed on him, drawn towards something that lay beyond his understanding and beyond his ability to provide. The calls from the forest were coming more frequently now, echoing across the meadow and the trees, and the boy began to wonder if they were calls from Ember, the dragon reaching out to something in the distance, or calls directed at Ember, something calling the dragon toward its own kind, toward a world and a destiny that existed beyond the boy's reach or knowledge. The mystery of it was both beautiful and painful, a reminder that no matter how much they loved each other, there were parts of Ember that would always belong to something larger and wilder than their bond. The boy spent the remaining weeks of winter and early spring in a kind of intentional savouring. He memorised things with the deliberate focus of someone who understood their value. The way Ember's scales caught the light in the early morning, how they seemed to hold the sunrise within them, shimmering with subtle hues of orange and gold and deep crimson. The particular chirp the dragon made when waking up, a sound that was somehow both gentle and authoritative, a greeting to the new day. The feel of the dragon's warm breath when Ember rested its head against the boy's chest, the heat of it penetrating through his shirt, a comfort that spoke of life and presence and the undeniable reality of this bond between them. The specific quality of the silence that fell between them when they sat together without needing to fill the space with activity or movement, a silence that was full and rich and complete in itself. They had quiet days by the creek where Ember would hunt for fish and the boy would sit on the bank watching. The boy noticed everything during these moments, the way the dragon would go very still before striking, the coiled energy in those powerful muscles, the sudden flash of movement as Ember caught prey with increasing precision. The boy watched as his companion developed skill and confidence, understanding that each successful hunt was taking the dragon further along the path toward independence. They had evenings by the fire where they simply existed in each other's presence, the boy reading or working on simple repairs while Ember dozed nearby, the dragon's breathing gradually becoming deeper and more regular as true sleep took hold. They had mornings where they walked through the meadow together, Ember pausing to investigate interesting smells and textures while the boy trailed behind, watching, always watching, trying to hold the images and feelings tight enough that they might not slip away entirely. He watched the way Ember moved through the grass, the dragon's tail swishing, the wings folded carefully against the dragon's sides. He watched the way Ember's eyes tracked movement in the sky, how the dragon would sometimes stand very still, head tilted upward, as though listening to something the boy could not hear. One morning in mid-March, when the snow had mostly melted and the earth was soft and muddy beneath their feet, the boy took Ember on one final deep expedition into the forest. They walked further than they had ever walked before, pushing through the underbrush, climbing over fallen trees, crossing streams that were running high with snowmelt. The boy followed Ember's lead, trusting the dragon's instincts, understanding that there was something the dragon needed to show him, or perhaps needed to find. As the sun began to move toward the western sky, they emerged from the forest onto a high ridge that looked out over a vast wild landscape that the boy had never seen before. The ridge overlooked a deep valley where multiple rivers converged, where the land stretched out green and untamed in all directions. There were mountains in the distance, peaks that seemed to touch the clouds themselves, jagged and magnificent and fierce in their beauty. There were forests that went on and on, seemingly endless, rolling across the landscape in waves of darker green. There were meadows and glades, and valleys all spreading out beneath them. There was a world that was vast and beautiful, and completely separate from the world of the cottage and the meadow. It was the world that dragons were meant to inhabit, wild and untamed, and full of possibility. Ember moved toward the very edge of the ridge, wings slightly spread as if already feeling the currents of air that swept across this high place. The dragon was absolutely still for a moment, and the boy came to stand beside his companion, understanding somehow that they had reached a kind of threshold. This was what lay beyond the boundaries of what they had known together. This was what Ember was meant for. This was the landscape of destiny itself, waiting with patient majesty. The boy did not speak. He placed his hand on the dragon's neck, feeling the smooth scales beneath his palm, feeling the strength of the muscle, feeling the life that thrummed through this magnificent creature. He could feel Ember's heartbeat, accelerated slightly, the dragon's breathing steady but deeper than usual. The boy understood that the dragon knew what was about to happen, that some part of Ember's ancient instinct recognized that this moment was significant, that it marked a turning point. He stood there in silence as the sun moved lower, as the light began to take on that golden quality that came in the late afternoon, the kind of light that seemed to illuminate everything from within. He stood there, and he loved the dragon with every part of himself, and he knew that this love would have to be enough. He committed to memory the weight of his hand on the dragon's neck, the temperature of the scales beneath his fingers, the rise and fall of the dragon's breathing. He held this moment suspended in time, understanding even as it was happening that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. When the sun reached the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple, Ember made that call again. The long wailing cry that seemed to echo across the landscape, carrying further than it ever had before. The boy heard it bounce off the distant mountains, heard it travel across the valleys. And then impossibly, he heard an answer, a distant cry that came from somewhere far away, a sound that matched Ember's call in a way that made it clear there was something responding, something that understood the language the dragon was speaking. The boy's heart clenched. This was the moment. He could feel it approaching, could feel the weight of it settling over him like a blanket. He squeezed Ember gently, one final time, and he stepped back. Ember looked at the boy, and in those golden eyes the boy saw recognition of what was happening. The dragon moved closer for a moment, pressing the scaled head against the boy's chest, and the boy felt the warmth of the dragon and the vibration of that beautiful call. Then, with a gentleness that belied the power in those muscles, Ember stepped away. The dragon extended its wings fully, and the boy could see how magnificent they had become, spanning easily 7 or 8 feet in each direction, the scales catching the last light of the day and glowing like burnished gold. Ember looked at the boy one more time, and then the dragon launched itself into the sky. The boy watched as Ember rose higher and higher, watched as the dragon became smaller and smaller against the vast expanse of sky. He watched as Ember flew toward the mountains, toward the distant valleys, toward the vast and wild world that had been waiting for this dragon since before the egg had ever hatched. He watched until Ember was nothing more than a small point of movement against the darkening sky. He watched until the dragon disappeared completely from sight. And then the boy sat down on the ridge, right there at the edge of the world, and he wept. He wept for the loss of this creature that had meant everything to him. He wept for the end of a chapter that had contained some of the most beautiful and meaningful moments of his life. He wept for the release of something precious and wild back into the world, where it belonged. But even as he wept, he knew that his tears were not entirely tears of sadness. They were also tears of joy, tears of gratitude, tears of a love so profound that it transcended even the pain of letting go. He wept until the sun had fully set and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, one by one, like small lights being lit in the deepness of evening. He wept until his chest ached and his eyes burned, and he had no more tears left to shed. He wept until the crying itself became a kind of meditation, a way of honouring what had been and what was being released. When the tears finally stopped, the boy remained sitting on the ridge, looking out at the landscape that was now only barely visible in the starlight. The moon was rising, just beginning to emerge above the distant mountains, painting everything in shades of silver and grey. He felt empty, but it was not an unpleasant emptiness. It was the emptiness that comes when something precious has been released fully and completely, when love has finally given way to letting go. It was the kind of emptiness that had room for peace, for acceptance, for the understanding that some endings are also beginnings. He felt peaceful in a way that he had not expected to feel, a peace that settled over him like a blanket, warm and comforting even in the cool night air. The walk back to the cottage took much longer in the darkness, but the boy found that he did not mind. He moved slowly and deliberately, pausing occasionally to look up at the stars, noticing how bright they were without the firelight of the cottage to wash them out. He could see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and he thought about how vast the universe was, how much space there was in the world for Ember to explore and discover. He thought about the dragon flying somewhere in the darkness, thought about Ember using the stars as a guide, just as the boy was doing now. He thought about the dragon finding its way in the world, finding food and shelter, and perhaps others of its kind. He thought about whatever adventures lay ahead for the creature that had hatched from an egg in his hands, adventures that he would never witness, but that he could imagine, could celebrate even from a distance. When he reached the cottage late that night, he went inside and built up the fire. He prepared tea, going through the familiar motions that had become so much a part of his daily routine. He found comfort in these small actions, in the way the kettle began to sing as the water heated, in the way the steam rose from the cup as he poured, in the particular aroma of the tea leaves as they steeped. These were the rituals that held the world together, he thought. These small repeated actions that created meaning and continuity in the face of change and loss. He sat by the window and watched the night, understanding that this was a goodbye of sorts. Not a goodbye that meant he would never see Ember again, but a goodbye that marked the end of what had been and the beginning of what would come next. The cottage felt different to him now, charged with the presence of absence, full of the echoes of companionship that was no longer there. He could almost see Ember curled up by the fire, could almost hear the soft sound of the dragon's breathing. These ghosts of presence were not entirely painful. They were also reminders of how fully and completely they had been together. The boy did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire and he remembered. He remembered the day he had found the egg, remembered the exact warmth of it in his hands, remembered the moment when it had cracked and this small, wet, perfect creature had emerged, blinking up at him with those golden eyes. He remembered learning to care for another being, remembered the initial uncertainty giving way to confidence, remembered the companionship and the joy and the deep, aching love that had grown between them over the months. He remembered every moment of watching Ember grow and change and become more fully itself. He remembered the dragon's first tentative flights, the hunt in the forest, the way Ember had learned to call out to the world and receive answers. He remembered all of it, held it all carefully in his mind like precious objects that he was storing away for safekeeping. By the time morning came, with the first light just beginning to filter through the window, the boy felt different. Not healed, not recovered, but changed in some fundamental way that he couldn't entirely put into words. He understood, with a clarity that seemed to shine from within him, that what he and Ember had shared was not something that was lost or finished. It was something that would continue to exist, would continue to matter, would continue to shape who he was and how he moved through the world as long as the boy lived. As long as Ember lived, carrying the memory of this bond within itself, the connection would remain, solid and eternal and true. The boy rose from his chair and opened the cottage door. The morning was cool and fresh, carrying the scents of spring and growth and possibility. He stepped outside into the new day, and he found that he could smile. The smile was tinged with sadness, but it was genuine. He had loved something wild and beautiful and precious, and he had loved it enough to let it go. That was enough. That was more than enough. Over the following days and weeks, the boy established a new routine. He continued to go to the ridge occasionally, hoping perhaps to glimpse Ember in the sky, hoping perhaps to hear that distinctive call echoing across the landscape. He would stand at the edge of that high place, exactly where he and Ember had stood on that final afternoon, and he would look out at the mountains and forests, imagining the path that the dragon had taken. He would sometimes sit there for hours thinking and remembering, and gradually learning to transform his grief into something else, something that was still love, but tempered with acceptance and the peace of knowing that Ember had found its way. And sometimes on quiet mornings or still evenings, he thought he heard it. He heard the cry of a dragon, carried on the wind from some distant place, a sound that was distant enough that he could not be entirely certain it was Ember. But he chose to believe that it was. He chose to believe that the dragon was alive and wild and free, and thinking, perhaps, of the boy who had raised it, carrying the memory of that bond within itself, as it flew through the vast world. And in choosing to believe this, he found a kind of comfort, a way to maintain the connection, even across the great distance that now separated them. The boy's life at the cottage returned to a kind of normalcy, but it was a different normal than what had come before. The cottage felt larger and quieter without Ember, but it did not feel empty. It felt full of memories, full of the echoes of companionship, full of the love that had filled it during those months of caring for the dragon. Every corner held a story. The corner where Ember had first learned to walk, the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals, the roof where the dragon had stood watching the world, the space by the fire where the dragon had slept. The boy would sometimes sit by the fire and remember a particular moment, would let himself sink into the memory and experience it again in his mind. Ember sleeping in the afternoon sun, the dragon's sides rising and falling with each breath, the scales glowing warmly in the golden light, the dragon learning to hunt, that moment of perfect coordination and instinct and strength. The first time they had flown together, the terror and exhilaration of it, the way the ground had seemed to fall away infinitely far below them, and he would feel that familiar ache, that sense of loss that would probably never entirely go away. But with it came a sense of gratitude, a knowledge that he had been privileged to be part of something magical and rare. Winter came again, as the boy knew it would. It snowed and the meadow was covered in white, and the world became quiet and cold and still. But he did not spend that winter waiting and watching and wondering when Ember would venture into the forest, as he had the year before. The wonder was different now. He wondered how Ember was faring in the mountains, whether the dragon had found others of its kind, whether the bond they had formed gave the dragon strength in facing the challenges of the wild world. He wondered if the dragon remembered the cottage, remembered the boy, remembered those quiet mornings and evenings together. He wondered if dragons dreamed, and if so, what Ember dreamed about. The boy understood that the ending of his story with Ember was not really an ending at all. It was a transformation. The intense daily companionship had evolved into something different, something that allowed for growth and freedom and the pursuit of destiny. The love remained, but it had taken on a new shape, one that could hold the vast distance between them and still remain solid and true. It was a love that did not require proximity or constant contact. It was a love that could exist across mountains and valleys, across seasons and years. It was a love that had become larger and more encompassing by being released. As the seasons turned and the world continued its eternal cycle of change and renewal, the boy found that he could think of Ember without the sharp pain that had characterized those first weeks after the departure. Instead, he found himself thinking of the dragon with something closer to celebration. He had been part of Ember's story, perhaps one of the most crucial parts, the bridge between egg and wild dragon. He had helped the dragon become what it was meant to be. He had held the space for Ember's transformation, and then had the strength and love to let the dragon go. And the dragon, in turn, had shown the boy what love truly meant when it was willing to release the beloved so that they could soar into their own destiny. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose, the kind of sunset that seemed to last forever, each moment bleeding into the next in a gradual transformation of colour and light. The boy sat by his window, looking out at the meadow where he had first found the egg, where he had first held the warm, glowing object in his hands and felt the future shifting. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a year. The world had changed so much since then. He had changed so much since then. But the love remained, unchanging and eternal. The memory remained clear and perfect and preserved. And as long as those two things existed, Ember would not truly be gone. The dragon lived on in his heart, in his mind, in every quiet moment when he paused and let himself remember. The boy allowed his mind to wander to all the moments still waiting to happen. Spring would come again, and with it would come new growth, new possibilities. The meadow would fill with wildflowers. The birds would return to the trees. Life would continue its endless renewal. And somewhere in that vast and beautiful world, Ember would be living and flying and becoming more fully itself with each passing day. The boy found comfort in this knowledge, found peace in the understanding that the dragon was thriving, was whole, was exactly where it was meant to be. He thought about how different his life was now, compared to just a year ago. Then he had been alone in this cottage with nothing but his routines and his quiet thoughts. Now he carried within himself the memory of profound connection, of love that had been tested and proven true. He carried the knowledge that he was capable of loving something beyond himself, of putting another's needs and freedom above his own desires. He had learned something about the true nature of love, something that went deeper than attachment or possession, or the need to hold something close. As darkness fell completely outside the window, the boy sat peacefully by the fire, feeling the warmth of the flames against his skin. He could almost feel Ember's presence, could almost hear the gentle sound of the dragon's breathing. But he did not need the dragon to be physically present anymore to feel this connection. The bond had transcended the physical. It existed now in the realm of memory and emotion and understanding. The boy let his eyes close slowly, feeling the weight of the day settling over him, feeling the peace that came with acceptance and understanding. Somewhere out in the world, under the same stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the cottage, a dragon was flying free, wild and strong and beautiful, carrying within itself the memory of a boy who had loved it enough to let it go. And the boy who had loved it carried that knowledge with him always, a kind of light in his heart that would never fade, a connection that would never truly be severed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered, everything that would ever matter. The boy let himself sink deeper into the comfortable peace of the moment, let himself drift into the quiet space between waking and sleep where memories lived and possibilities existed. And in this gentle place of transition, he found himself at peace with the ending that was also a beginning, at peace with the love that had learned to let go, at peace with the knowledge that some bonds could not be broken even by distance or time or change. The fire crackled softly, and the night deepened, and the boy rested, carrying his dragon with him in his heart, forever.